Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM, the official podcast of Monsters.rent. I'm Justin Lewis here with my friend Tanner Wayland.
Hi. That's all I
Uh,
got,
t-
sorry. Yeah,
no,
good to
that,
see
that's
you
totally
all.
fine.
Great to
Yeah.
be here.
Tanner and I are in rare form today. We just recorded another episode, which went a little bit long. So we're gonna kind of do this fast mode. We're gonna do a speed run, but which probably means we'll just go the normal length because I'm a
Yeah,
little bit
that's how it always goes, is we're like, "Oh, let's be fast." Okay, 20 minutes
exactly.
later.
Exactly. Without further ado, though, let's jump in. Actually, first, a quick mention. Follow us on Instagram at How to Be Better DM and at Monsters.rent. Now let's jump in. Today, we're going to talk about the flip side of one of our episodes last month, which was how to add tragedy to your game. Today, we're talking about how to add comedy to your game. And in the Shakespearean definition of the word, comedy just means a happy ending, right? Everyone, like Tanner said last time, everyone gets married essentially. In this episode, we're going to talk specifically about making people smile, laugh, or giggle, kind of that sort of comedy, the comedy that we're more familiar with today. Not necessarily just a happy ending, because obviously everyone wants a happy ending, but more of how to add comical moments or silly moments or, hee-haws and guffaws and laughs to your game.
Yeah, and it's so important because I think, being a DM and playing D&D is so much of it is about fun, and it's hard to separate fun from funny, right? In terms of just practicality, right? Because you're having more fun if you think things are funny, and and if you're able to joke with each other and riff, and that's sometimes there's not always a place for that in every part of the game, right? Because like we mentioned last time, if you don't have tragic moments or more serious moments, then the game kind of loses some of its weight. But honestly, I would argue that uh, that if you have 5 times the amount of comedy to tragedy, then you're in a pretty good place because people are happy to come. They feel like they're in a very friendly environment, and but there's also some issues, right? Like sometimes people don't feel like, maybe things are too straightforward, or you feel like there's not enough room for growth, or not growth, room for like silliness, where people are like, oh, everyone wants to just get through the encounter. They don't want to hear me make a joke about like, oh, I hit this guy in the knee, or trip him up, because everyone wants to know if the mechanics are right for that and everything like that, right? People get over serious is my main point. And I think that you can get around that by just, as the DM, putting your best, silly foot forward and being like, hey, not everything needs to be super serious?
Absolutely. You definitely need to know the tenor of the table, and maybe that's the wrong phrase. Understand what people want and when. And if you listen to your characters, you'll get a good sense of when they're willing to be silly or when they're willing to be serious. My rule of thumb is when it's a specific plot point, it's probably going to be serious, probably. And when I say specific plot point, I mean like if something happens one way or the other, the campaign has major consequences, right? Different differences in trajectory. But if it's not so uh, serious, obviously, in terms of consequences, definitely feel free and add in some comical elements. Also, if it is serious, there's nothing wrong with sort of taking breaks in between the seriousness, right? So if they're in, a starship and they have to find their way off before everyone knows they're there, uh, you can take a small moment to be like, yeah, you open up a door and you find a stormtrooper sitting on the toilet, right? You obviously
Yeah.
close that and then you get back to work, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But when you get to the final boss scene and you're fighting the Dark Lord in his capital ship, you may or may not want comical elements unless your party trades in comical elements on a day-to-day basis, right? If they fight that way, then that's how you need to play. So definitely listen to your party.
Yeah. And speaking about party, I think as a DM, you can certainly build in moments that you think will be kind of funny, like challenges specifically. if you throw in like a puzzle or a skill check that's just kind of silly in general, right? Like people trying to work through, like sneakily through a factory filled with a bunch of breakable statues. And then, something falls over, then it's like, you kind of like, there are ways that you can turn like a skill check or something else kind of into a potentially comedic situation, right? But I think the best way that you can actually add it into your campaign is just paying really close attention to what your players want to do. So sometimes players want to do something that in real life you just couldn't do. And I'm not talking magic. I'm saying like no, it just doesn't make sense. And there's a couple options you could go with that. You could be the DM who's like, no, that doesn't make sense. Try again. Or you actually do it, but it goes how it should go, which is terribly. And that's hilarious, where essentially you don't always have to shut down your players if they're just doing something stupid or something that wasn't that well thought out. It's like, no, let them do it and then play it up. Don't turn their mistake into something that's just like, "Oh, take 10 steps back," but instead be like, "Oh, man, let's accentuate how funny this is and how terribly it goes." And you can do that a lot with your tone and how you act, and you're like, "Okay, roll that dice," and then explain and be like, "So, you wanted to do this. This is what actually happened." Uh, I think that you really want to just embrace what your players are kind of the opportunities they give you, right? Both in terms of their mistakes, but also sometimes they're being a little bit silly in a conversation, and you can tell that. Instead of like letting your characters over seriousness pull them back to being serious, give into that like more often than not, and like kind of let the conversation tend in a sillier direction. A lot of it is just adding silliness to the game isn't so much you being super funny, but it's more about not shutting down the natural funniness and the silliness that comes with just playing with a bunch of people, right?
That's probably the best tip that we can give is that if you want comedy in your game, realize that you don't have to be the comical person, right? You can just let your players be the funny ones, right? They'll do funny things. They'll do things like Tanner said that are nonsensical. And every so often, you can do things that are somewhat similar or you think that would make them laugh, but you don't
Yep.
actually have to be the comical one. Just let your players be the funny ones. Everyone will laugh and, uh, life will go on.
Yeah, and kind of going along with that, if you make a mistake, and let's say you're like, "Oh, this is going to be so difficult," and then the player comes up with a really overly simplistic solution that totally works, then laugh at yourself. Be like, "Okay, so I plan on this. Well, I guess this is done. Okay, what now?" They're like, that's also a funny situation, and if you open up and kinda let yourself be a little bit vulnerable there, it can be hilarious for your players too. And, I think th in terms of adding silliness, lightheartedness is the key to it all, right? Don't don't try and ridicule players to an extreme extent. You can kind of poke fun at like what they chose to do, but don't just like if you can tell it's bothering them, move on. You know, or make it so that you're more laughing at the situation rather than them, because you don't want to start making fun of people that way in a way that they get really hurt by. But I think that you can absolutely add it to every session that you do, and it's only going to make it so that players are excited to come back week after week.
Yeah. And going off of something I heard from Writing Excuses, which is Brandon Sanderson's writing podcast, or at least it was. I don't know if he still does it, but they say for comedy, you take something normal and add something unexpected. So, example, my stormtrooper pooping on the toilet, right? The party is running, trying to find a place to hide. They open the door. Stormtroopers basically in full armor sitting on the toilet, right? That's normal because that's what people do, but it's also unexpected because you're like, this is a Star Destroyer. Why is it, they're not supposed to have bathrooms in the Galactic Empire, of the Sith. Another example, yesterday, my wife and I were kind of joking around, like, what if you don't tip the Door Dasher, like, who's bringing you your food? And I was like, "Yeah, he just brings out like a giant bean, like a bean like the size of a bowling ball and just gives it to you. That's what he gives it to you." And it's normal because it's food, but it's also like it's just a big bean, you know? Like it's weird. So kind of stuff like that. She got a kick out of it, but uh stuff like that where you take something slightly normal and you make it unexpected in some way that sort of breaks people's state and makes them put their head up and pay attention. But also when they think about it, they're like, that's why? Like, what? And
Yeah.
it's easier said than done, obviously, but that's sort of a small framework that you can work off of.
Yeah, and a lot of times funniness, and silliness is just about contrast, like you were saying, right? It's like, "Oh, that's odd." Right? Like, it's finding something that, like, oh, maybe works, but it's a little bit off kilter. Like, oh, there's 3 pigs that you could win at the fair. Wha 2 of them are, like, pork chop, and then another one bacon, then the 3rd one's, like, Guillermo, right? It's like, it's about that incongruity, and you can play with that a whole lot of ways where it's like, okay, maybe they're in a serious conversation with an NPC who's all business, and then suddenly they mention the weather and he gets really weirdly specific, right? He's like, no, please. The 9-day forecast says this. How dare you? Like it's just adding a little bit of weirdness within like a bunch of normalness. And sometimes that's the most funny situation there is, right? Uh, but yeah, I would say that, something to avoid though when trying to be funny is trying too hard. Um, because I've been guilty of this in my life. I've had multiple people being like, "Man, you're really funny when you're not trying." And
Thanks.
and through my tears, I'm like, "Thank you." Uh, and I think that that's kind of the key where it's like, hey, if a joke doesn't land or something that you thought was going to be silly that no one really paid attention, that's okay. Don't let it, trip you up at all. Just keep going. And once again, don't take it too personally if something you planned to be funny wasn't. Uh, More be excited when you're able to accentuate the funniness that a player is trying to get going, right? Or just create it out of what they're doing. That's oftentimes a lot more funny, and you're going to enjoy yourself a lot more that way because you have less expectations built up, right?
Definitely don't try to be funny. Just do things that you think would be funny. And if you can make yourself laugh, then that's a win. And it's very likely that other people will laugh. Sometimes they won't, but that's probably the third tip that I would give. Do things that would make you laugh, not do things to be funny, but do things that you think are funny, right? And there's a
Yeah.
very fine line there. One is you're trying way too hard. The other is, this is great. Do you understand the difference?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And so I think, we said we'd keep it short and we will because frankly it's a simple topic. But, you know, uh, I guess my last thought before I pass back to Justin is, don't fight the funny if you don't have to, right? If it's a really serious moment, then it's okay to do it then. But for most of the campaign, don't let mechanics or you thinking that something's ridiculous like become like a negative, right? Let them accentuate things and actually make it funnier. Kind of like it's like letting the stream flow. Remove the blockages rather than try to redirect it. If that makes
I
sense.
love that. That honestly, we should make that into a t-shirt, Tanner. Don't fight the funny. Because that is, I love that saying so much. So here's um, my last thought. Why are impatient people always so skinny?
I don't know why.
It's because they can't stand the weight. Uh, that was a small joke for
It's
you, but
so dumb.
yeah. See,
That's
so
so dumb. I love it.
don't overthink it. Just do things that have fun, and if you do need to, you can go look up jokes online, right? If that's what you really need to do, but I wouldn't resort to that. Uh, just my top 3 tips, let your players do the funny. Don't fight the funny, as Tanner said. Add normal to unexpected. And then lastly, do things that make you laugh, and you should be just fine. This has been How to Be a Better DM. We're so very grateful for you listening to us again in this new year, and we wish you the best roles for you and the worst roles for your players. I'm just kidding. But seriously, natural 20s for everyone. We'll be back next week for another great episode. Until then, let's roll initiative.